In 1910, on the quiet outskirts of California, where rolling hills met the edge of a dense fog-shrouded forest, stood an imposing boarding school known as St. Augustine's Academy. From a distance it was a vision of grandeur, its red brick facade rising 3 stories high, crowned with gabled roofs and flanked by tall, narrow windows that glinted like watchful eyes under the pale sunlight. Ivy clung to its walls, giving it an air of timeless respectability, as though it had stood for centuries rather than mere decades. The surrounding grounds were meticulously kept, with manicured lawns stretching toward a wrought iron gate that marked the boundary between the school and the outside world. To passers-by, it was a place of learning, discipline, and refinement, a sanctuary where wealthy families from San Francisco, Los Angeles, and beyond sent their children to be molded into the next generation of leaders, scholars, and gentlemen. Parents, reassured by the school's sterling reputation and its promise of moral and academic rigor, entrusted their sons and daughters to its care without a second thought. Yet behind the polished exterior and the promises of enlightenment, something sinister stirred within the walls of Augustine's, a darkness that waited patiently, biding its time. The school was situated far from any major town, a deliberate choice by its founders to foster an environment of focus and seclusion. The nearest settlement, a small village called Harrow's Crossing, lay nearly 10 miles away, connected by a winding dirt road that cut through fields of wild grass and gnarled oak trees. This isolation was part of the school's allure. Advertisements in newspapers boasted of a place free from the distractions of city life, where young minds could flourish under strict guidance and a classical curriculum. The headmaster, Dr. Elias Warwick, was a figure of considerable renown, a man whose stern demeanor and impeccable credentials commanded respect. His letters to prospective parents were filled with lofty phrases about character building, intellectual pursuit, and the virtues of discipline. He spoke of Augustine's as a beacon of hope, a place where children would not only learn but become exemplars of virtue. His words were persuasive, and the school's enrollment grew steadily, drawing children from some of California's most prominent families. The campus itself was a labyrinth of stone and wood, designed with an almost monastic austerity. The main building housed classrooms, a grand dining hall, and the headmaster's office, its heavy oak door always slightly ajar, as if inviting scrutiny yet warning against it. Dormitories stood separate, one for boys and one for girls, each a mirror of the other, with long echoing hallways lined with narrow beds and small locked trunks for personal belongings. The air inside was perpetually cool even in the heat of summer, and carried a faint smell of wax and old books. A chapel, modest but adorned with stained glass windows depicting saints and scholars, sat at the heart of the grounds, its bell tolling each morning to signal the start of the day. Beyond the manicured lawns the forest loomed, its dense canopy casting long shadows that seemed to creep closer as the sun set. Students were forbidden from entering the woods, a rule enforced with such severity that it sparked endless speculation among them about what lay hidden there. The faculty, handpicked by Dr. Warwick, were a peculiar group. They were not the warm, nurturing educators one might expect, but rather a collection of severe, enigmatic figures who seemed more suited to a military academy than a school for children aged 10 to 16. There was Miss Clara Hawthorne, the literature teacher, whose sharp tongue and piercing gaze could silence a room with a single glance. Her lessons were rigorous, filled with dense texts and moral allegories, but her punishments for inattention were whispered to be unusually harsh hours spent copying lines in the dim light of a basement room. Miss Theodore Grayson, who taught mathematics, was a tall, gaunt man with a perpetual frown, his fingers stained with ink and chalk as if he never left his desk. The children spoke of his habit of locking misbehaving students in a storage closet until they learned their sum. The other teachers, history, science, Latin, followed a similar pattern, knowledgeable, disciplined, but cold, their interactions with the students marked by an unsettling detachment. Even the groundskeeper, a silent man named Mr. Finch, seemed to carry an air of menace, his eyes following the children as they played on the lawns. To the outside world, St. Augustine's was a model institution. Visitors, though rare, were greeted with polished tours, during which the children performed recitations and demonstrated impeccable manners. The dining hall, with its long oak tables and gleaming silverware, hosted occasional dinners for local dignitaries, who left impressed by the school's order and elegance. Parents received glowing reports of their children's progress, written in Dr. Warwick's precise, flowing script. These letters spoke of academic achievements, moral growth, and the forging of lifelong friendships. Yet for all its outward perfection, There were cracks in the facade that only the children could see. They noticed the way the teachers' smiles never reached their eyes, the way certain doors were always locked, the way the headmaster's voice carried a faint edge of menace when he spoke of obedience. They felt the weight of unseen eyes watching them, even in the quiet of their dormitories at night. The students themselves were a diverse group, though unified by their parents' wealth and ambition. There were sons of bankers and daughters of railroad tycoons, children whose futures were already mapped out in boardrooms and ballrooms. Some arrived eager to please, others rebellious but quickly subdued by the school's rigid structure. They wore crisp uniforms, navy blazers for the boys, pleated skirts for the girls, and followed a schedule that left little room for idle. Mornings began with the chapel bell, followed by breakfast, classes, and supervised study periods. Evenings were for quiet reflection or group activities, always under the watchful gaze of the staff. The children formed tentative friendships, whispering in the dormitories about their lives back home, their dreams and increasingly their fears. They spoke of strange noises in the night, creaks that sounded like footsteps, murmurs that seemed to come from behind the wall. They noticed how certain classmates, after a reprimand or a trip to the headmaster's office, returned quieter, more withdrawn, their eyes hollow. The isolation of St. Augustine's amplified these. The children were cut off from the world, their only contact with their families through carefully monitored letters. Telephones were absent, and visits were discouraged except during designated holidays, which few parents attended due to the school's remote location. The children learned quickly that complaints were futile, letters hinting at discomfort or mistreatment were intercepted, and the writers faced consequence. A boy named Thomas, who wrote to his father about a teacher's cruelty, was made to stand in the courtyard for an entire day without food or water, his punishment a warning to others. The message was clear: St. Augustine's was a world unto itself, governed by rules that brooked no defiance. As the months passed, the atmosphere grew heavier. The children began to sense that something was wrong, though they couldn't name it. They noticed how the staff seemed to confer in hushed tones late at night, how Dr. Warwick's sermons in the chapel grew increasingly cryptic, filled with references to sacrifice and purification. They saw Mr. Finch digging in the gardens at odd hours, his spade turning earth in places where no flowers were planted. The forest too seemed to take on a life of its own, its shadows moving in ways that defied the wind. Some children swore they saw figures among the trees, tall, cloaked shapes that vanished when approached. Others spoke of dreams, vivid and shared, in which they were chased through endless corridors by faceless pursuers. These stories, whispered in the dark, bound the children together even as they drove a wedge of fear between them and the adults who controlled their lives. The parents far away in their city homes remained blissfully unaware. They continued to send tuition payments and receive glowing reports, unaware that their children were living in a place where discipline masked something far more sinister. The townsfolk of Harrow's Crossing too were distant from the school's inner workings. They saw the occasional delivery wagon or heard the chapel bell from afar, but they had little reason to question the institution. Augustine's was a pillar of the region, a source of pride even for those who never set foot on its grounds. Yet in the quiet moments, some villagers spoke of unease, a feeling that the school was too perfect, too removed, its silence too complete. They dismissed these thoughts as superstition, unaware that the truth was far darker than they could imagine. By the fall of 1910, the stage was set for tragedy. The children, once full of hope and curiosity, were now shadows of themselves, their laughter replaced by wary glances and whispered warnings. The staff, ever watchful, seemed to grow bolder, their punishments harsher, their secrecy more pronounced. The school, with its grand halls and pristine lawns, stood as a facade for something unspeakable, a place where innocence was not nurtured but targeted. The darkness that had always lingered within St. Augustine's was no longer content to wait. It was ready to emerge, and when it did, it would leave behind a legacy of horror that would echo through California's history for generations. The autumn of 1910 brought a crisp chill to the air around St. Augustine's Academy, the California boarding school that stood like a monolith against the backdrop of rolling hills and shadowed forest. The winding dirt road from Harrow's Crossing buzzed with activity as carriages and early motor cars arrived, their wheels kicking up dust that shimmered in the golden September light. Families from across the state, from the bustling streets of San Francisco to the sprawling estates of Los Angeles, sent their sons and daughters to this prestigious institution, each child a parcel of hopes and expectation. 26 children, aged 10 to 16, stepped onto the manicured lawns of St. Augustine's, their trunks heavy with books, clothes, and the weight of their parents' ambition. They were full of life, their voices a mix of nervous excitement and youthful defiance, unaware of the darkness that awaited them within the school's red brick walls. The children arrived in waves over a single week, each family's departure marked by tearful goodbyes or brisk farewells, depending on their temperament. Parents dressed in fine coats and hats shook hands with Dr. Willius Warwick, the headmaster, whose tall frame and stern features exuded authority. His welcomes were formal, his words carefully chosen, promising a transformative education that would shape their children into paragons of virtue and intellect. Mothers dabbed their eyes with lace handkerchiefs, fathers offered firm nods, and the children stood clutching their belongings, watching as their families' carriages disappeared down the road. For many, this was their first time so far from home, and the isolation of St. Augustine's 10 miles from the nearest village settled over them like a fog. The wrought iron gate clanged shut behind the last departing vehicle, its sound echoing across the grounds, a final note of separation from the world they knew. The children were a diverse group, though bound by the privilege of their family's wealth. There was Amelia Carter, a 12-year-old from San Francisco, whose father owned a shipping company. Her wide hazel eyes took in the school's towering facade with a mix of awe and apprehension, her blonde curls bouncing as she whispered to her new friend Clara about the adventure they were embarking on. Clara, a sharp-witted girl from Sacramento, was the daughter of a state senator, her quick laugh and bold demeanor masking a flicker of unease at the school's eerie quiet. Among the boys was James Whitaker, a lanky 15-year-old whose father was a railroad magnate. He arrived with a swagger, joking with his peers to hide his discomfort at being sent so far from his family's sprawling estate. Then there was Thomas Reed, a quiet boy of 11, whose parents were bankers in Los Angeles. He clutched a small leather-bound journal, already scribbling his thoughts about the strange cold air of the dormitories. The children were ushered into the main hall, a cavernous space with polished oak floors and chandeliers that cast flickering shadows on the wall. Portraits of past headmasters and benefactors stared down, their painted eyes seeming to follow the newcomers. Dr. Warwick addressed them in a voice that was both commanding and oddly soothing, outlining the rules of St. Augustine's, with a precision that left no room for misunderstanding. Punctuality, obedience and diligence were non-negotiable. Classes would begin at 7 each morning, following a chapel service. Meals were taken together in the dining hall, and free time was limited to supervised activities on the lawn. The forest beyond the grounds was strictly off-limits, a rule delivered with such intensity that it silenced the room. The children exchanged glances, some curious, others unnerved, but none dared to question the headmaster's authority. The dormitories, where the children would live, were stark and functional. The boys' dormitory, housed in a separate wing from the girls', was a long, narrow building with whitewashed walls and rows of iron-framed beds, each with a thin mattress and a single wool blanket. The girls' dormitory mirrored it, though its windows were draped with faded curtains that did little to soften the austerity. Each child was assigned a bed and a small trunk for their possessions, locked with a key they were instructed to keep on their person at all times. The air inside was damp, carrying the faint scent of mildew and wax, and the silence was broken only by the creak of floorboards underfoot. The children unpacked their belongings, photographs of family, favorite books, small keepsakes, trying to make the space feel like home, though the cold walls resisted their efforts. Meals were served in the grand dining hall, where long tables were set with plain but hearty fare, porridge for breakfast, stew or bread with cheese for lunch, and roasted meat with vegetables for dinner. The children sat in assigned seats, boys on one side, girls on the other, under the watchful eyes of the staff. Miss Clara Hawthorne, the literature teacher, presided over meals with a hawk-like gaze, her thin lips pursed as she noted any breach of etiquette. Miss Theodore Grayson, the mathematics teacher, patrolled the aisles, his long fingers tapping against his clipboard as he recorded infraction. The children learned quickly to eat in silence, their forks clinking softly against plates, their conversations reduced to whispers when the staff were out of earshot. The food was filling but bland, and some children, like Thomas, hid bits of bread in their pockets, sensing that hunger might become a companion in this place. The daily routine was relentless, designed to leave little room for idleness or rebellion. After breakfast, the children filed into the chapel, where Dr. Warwick delivered sermons that blended scripture with warnings about the perils of disobedience. His words were hypnotic, his deep voice filling the space, but there was an undercurrent of something unsettling, references to purification, to tests of character, that left the children shifting uncomfortably in the pews. Classes followed, each taught with a rigor that bordered on cruel. Miss Hawthorne's literature lessons demanded rote memorization of poetry and scripture, with mistakes met by sharp reprimands or extra assignments. Miss Grayson's mathematics classes were a gauntlet of complex equations, and those who faltered were sent to stand in the corner, facing the wall for hours. The other teachers, Mr. Langley for history, Miss Porter for science,
and Miss Daubois for Latin followed suit, their lessons heavy with expectation and light on encouragement. Despite the strictness, the children found moments of connection. In the dormitories at night they whispered stories of their lives back home. Amelia spoke of sailing on the bay with her father, her voice wistful as she described the salt air. James bragged about sneaking into his father's study to read forbidden novels, earning laughter from the other boys. Clara, ever the ringleader, organized secret games of cards under the blankets, her quick wit keeping spirits high. Thomas, the quiet one, listened more than he spoke, his journal filling with observations about the school, the way the teachers seemed to watch them too closely, the way the chapel bell sounded different at midnight, almost mournful. These stolen moments of camaraderie were a lifeline, a reminder that they were not alone even as the school's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. The staff, however, seemed to sense these bonds and worked to undermine the minor infractions. A late arrival to class, a whispered conversation were met with punishments that seemed designed to isolate. A girl named Emily was made to eat alone for a week after laughing during a lesson. A boy named Henry was sent to scrub the chapel floors after sharing a piece of candy with a friend. The punishments were not just about discipline, they carried a message: trust no one, rely on no one. The children began to guard their words even among friends, their eyes darting to the shadows where a teacher might be listening. Yet they could not shake the feeling that the staff were watching for more than misbehavior, that there was a purpose to their vigilance that went beyond maintaining order. As the weeks turned into months, the children's initial excitement gave way to a creeping unease. They noticed things that didn't add up: locked doors in the main building that led to nowhere, a faint hum that seemed to come from the basement at night, the way Mr. Finch, the groundskeeper, lingered near the forest's edge, his spade always in hand. They whispered about these oddities in the dormitories, their voices low to avoid detection. Clara, bold as ever, suggested sneaking out to explore, but even she hesitated when James pointed out the teacher's uncanny ability to know when rules were broken. Thomas wrote in his journal about a dream he'd had, a figure in a cloak standing at the edge of the forest, beckoning him closer. When he shared it with Amelia, she paled, admitting she'd had the same dream. The children's lives at Augustine's were a delicate balance of routine and fear, their days filled with the monotony of lessons, and the undercurrent of something unspoken. They ate together, studied together, and slept under the same roof, but they were never truly at ease. The school, with its grand halls and strict rules, was meant to be a place of growth, a haven where young minds could flourish. Instead it was becoming a cage, its walls closing in as the children sensed, without fully understanding, that they were part of something far larger and far darker than they could comprehend.
By late October 1910, the initial excitement of the new school year at St. Augustine's Academy had faded, replaced by a quiet tension that hung over the 26 children like a storm town. The grand halls, once a source of awe, now felt oppressive, their high ceilings and shadowed corners amplifying every creak and whisper. The children, ranging from 10 to 16, had settled into the rigid routine of classes, chapel and meals, but beneath their practiced obedience unease was growing. It began as murmurs in the dormitories, shared in hushed tones after lights out, when the distant toll of the chapel bell faded into the night. Stories of strange punishments and unsettling encounters with the staff spread among the students, each tale more disturbing than the last. These were not the typical complaints of strict teachers or long lessons. They hinted at something darker, a cruelty that went beyond discipline and bordered on malice. The first whispers came from small incidents, easily dismissed at first. Amelia Carter, the 12-year-old with blonde curls, recounted how Miss Clara Hawthorne, the literature teacher, had caught her daydreaming during a lesson on Dante. Instead of a simple reprimand, Miss Hawthorne had ordered Amelia to kneel on the cold stone floor of the classroom for an hour, her classmates forbidden from looking at her. The punishment left Amelia's knees bruised, but it was the teacher's expression, cold, almost gleeful, that haunted her. She shared this with Clara, her bold friend from Sacramento, who nodded grimly, having heard similar stories. Clara spoke of a boy in her Latin class, Henry, who had mispronounced a phrase and was sent to stand in a darkened hallway for the rest of the day, with no explanation beyond Mr. Daubois' curt command to reflect on his errors. When Henry returned, his face was pale and he refused to speak of what he'd seen or heard in that lonely corridor. These punishments were not isolated. James Whittaker, the lanky 15-year-old with a penchant for bravado, told of a night when he'd been caught sneaking a biscuit from the dining hall. Theodore Grayson, the mathematics teacher, didn't just confiscate the food, he locked James in a small windowless storage room in the basement for an entire night. The room was cold, the air thick with the smell of damp stone, and James swore he heard faint scratching sounds from behind the walls, like fingers clawing at the mortar. When he emerged at dawn, shivering and silent, his usual swagger was gone, replaced by a weariness that made the younger children uneasy. Thomas Reed, the quiet 11-year-old who chronicled everything in his journal, wrote of these incidents with growing alarm, noting how the punishments seemed designed not to correct but to break. He overheard a girl named Emily whisper that she'd been forced to skip meals for 2 days after dropping a book in class, her hunger pangs ignored by Miss Porter, the science teacher, who watched her with a thin, unreadable smile. The children began to see the staff in a new light. The teachers, once merely strict, now seemed less like educators and more like wardens in a prison disguised as a school. Miss Hawthorne's sharp tongue was no longer just a quirk. Her punishments carried a vindictive edge, as if she took pleasure in the children's discomfort. Mr. Grayson, with his gaunt frame and ink-stained fingers, had a habit of looming over students during lessons, his presence suffocating, his punishments arbitrary. Langley, the history teacher, was quieter but no less unnerving, his lectures on ancient sacrifices and wars delivered with a strange intensity, his eyes lingering on certain students as if sizing them up. Even Mr. Finch, the groundskeeper, who rarely spoke, became a figure of dread. The children noticed how he watched them during their brief moments of outdoor play, his gaze unblinking, his spade always close at hand, as if ready to dig more than just flower beds. The dormitories, where the children retreated each night, became the only place they could speak freely, though even there they kept their voices low. The walls seemed to carry sound, and the teachers had an uncanny ability to appear when least expected. In the boys' dormitory, James gathered a small group, Thomas, Henry and a few others, to share what they'd seen. Henry, still shaken from his time in the hallway, whispered about a locked door he'd noticed at the end of the corridor, one that vibrated slightly, as if something were moving behind it. In the girls' dormitory, Clara and Amelia led similar discussions, piecing together fragments of their experiences. Clara, ever defiant, suggested they test the staff's rules, perhaps by sneaking into a forbidden area to see what they were hiding. But Amelia, remembering her bruised knees, hesitated, her voice trembling as she admitted she'd seen Miss Hawthorne standing outside the dormitory window one night, staring in long after curfew. The children's stories grew darker as the weeks passed. A boy named Samuel claimed he'd been sent to the basement for talking out of turn, where he was left in a room with no light, the door bolted shut. He spoke of hearing whispers through the walls, not in English but in a language he couldn't understand, low and rhythmic like a When he was finally released, Mr. Dubois was waiting, his face expressionless, and warned Samuel that worse awaited if he spoke of it. Another girl, Margaret, told of a punishment where she was forced to stand in the chapel at midnight, holding a heavy candelabrum until her arms shook, while Dr. Warwick read passages from a book she didn't recognize, his voice rising and falling in a way that made her skin crawl. These stories, shared in the dim glow of stolen candlelight, bound the children together, their fear forging a fragile alliance against the adults who controlled their lives. What troubled the children most was the unpredictability of the punishments. There seemed to be no clear line between minor infractions and severe consequences. A dropped pencil, a moment of laughter, a glance out of turn, any could trigger a response that felt disproportionate, even cruel. Thomas, in his journal, began to catalogue these incidents, noting patterns. The basement was a frequent punishment site, often for the slightest missteps. Meals were withheld not just as discipline, but as a test, with the staff watching to see who would break first, and certain children, particularly the quieter ones like himself, seemed to draw more attention as if their silence made them targets. He wrote of a night when he'd woken to find Mr. Finch standing at the foot of his bed, staring down at him in the dark, only to vanish when Thomas sat up, gasping. The next morning, Miss Finch acted as if nothing had happened, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched more closely than before. The children also noticed the staff's strange behavior among themselves. Late at night, when they were supposed to be asleep, they heard footsteps in the halls, the low murmur of voices in rooms that should have been empty. Clara, who had a knack for eavesdropping, crept to the edge of the girls' dormitory one night and overheard Miss Hawthorne and Miss Grayson speaking in the corridor. Their words were indistinct, but Clara caught phrases like "the time is near," and "they must be ready," spoken with a fervor that chilled her. She shared this with the others, and the group began to wonder if the staff were part of something larger, something beyond the school's stated mission of education. The idea of a secret purpose, though vague, took root,
fueled by the locked doors, the forbidden forest, and the cryptic sermons Warwick delivered in the chapel, which now spoke less of virtue and more of cleansing and the greater good. The children's isolation made these whispers all the more potent. Cut off from their families, with letters monitored and visits rare, they had no one to turn to but each other. Thomas tried writing to his parents about the punishments, carefully wording his letter to avoid suspicion, but it was returned to him, unopened, with a note from Dr. Warwick warning him to focus on his studies. Clara, bolder, attempted to slip a message into a delivery wagon, but Miss Finch intercepted it, his silent stare more terrifying than any lecture. The children learned to guard their words, their trust eroding even among themselves as fear took hold. Yet, they couldn't stop talking, couldn't stop sharing the fragments of what they'd seen and heard, as if piecing together the truth might protect them. By November, the whispers of cruelty had become a chorus, each story adding to the growing dread. The children no longer saw Augustine's as a school but as a place where something was terribly wrong. The staff, with their cold eyes and calculated punishments, were not just strict, they were something else, something the children couldn't name but felt in their bones. The dormitories, once a refuge, now felt like cells, the locked trunks and barred windows a reminder of their captivity. As the days grew shorter, and the forest shadows stretched closer to the school, the children clung to their fragile alliances, their whispered stories a shield against the darkness they sensed was coming. They didn't yet know the full extent of the horror that awaited, but the whispers were enough to tell them that St. Augustine's was no haven. It was a trap, and they were its prey. November 9, Augustine's Academy in a chilling gloom, the California air heavy with the threat of an approaching storm. The 26 children, now well into their first term, had grown accustomed to the school's oppressive routine, but the whispers of cruelty that had circulated in the dormitories had left them wary, their trust in the staff eroded by weeks of unsettling punishments and cryptic warning. The night that would come to be known as the Night of Terror began like any other, with the children trudging to their dormitories after a silent dinner in the grand hall. The sky was a roiling mass of grey, thunder rumbling in the distance, and the wind rattled the tall, narrow windows of the school, casting eerie shadows across the stone walls. The children, sensing the storm's approach, huddled under their thin blankets, their whispers quieter than usual, as if the weather itself demanded silence. But this night was different. Something sinister was stirring, and the cruelty that had simmered beneath the surface of Augustine's was about to erupt into a horror that would scar the institution forever. As the clock in the chapel tower struck midnight, the storm broke with a ferocity that shook the school's foundation. Rain lashed the windows and lightning illuminated the grounds in stark, fleeting flashes, revealing the twisted shapes of the oak trees beyond the lawn. The children, restless in their beds, heard the usual creaks and murmurs of the old building, but there was something else, a low, rhythmic sound like footsteps moving in unison, echoing through the halls. Clara, the bold girl from Sacramento, sat up in the girls' dormitory, her sharp ears catching the sound of heavy bolts sliding into place. She crept to the door, her heart pounding, and tried the handle only to find it locked from the outside. Across the grounds in the boys' dormitory, James Whittaker, the lanky 15-year-old, made the same discovery. His attempts to force the door met with unyielding resistance. Panic rippled through the dormitories as the children realized they were trapped. Their usual escape routes, windows, secondary exits, barred or boarded shut. The staff, who had always been a looming presence, now revealed their true intent. Gone was the pretense of discipline or education. Their actions were deliberate, coordinated, and terrifyingly purposeful. Miss Clara Hawthorne, her severe face, illuminated by a flickering lantern, appeared in the girls' dormitory, her voice cold and commanding as she ordered the children to remain silent and stay in their beds. In the boys' dormitory, Miss Theodore Grayson, his gaunt frame more menacing in the dim light, stood at the entrance, a heavy keyring in his hand, his eyes glinting with something that wasn't anger but anticipation. Elias Warwick, the headmaster, was nowhere to be seen, but his absence only heightened the children's fear, as if he were orchestrating something from the shadows. The other teachers, Mr. Langley, Miss Porter, Dobar, moved through the halls, their footsteps synchronized, their faces unreadable but resolute, as if following a script they had rehearsed for months. What followed was not a random act of violence, but a calculated massacre, executed with a precision that chilled the children, trapped in their dormitories, had no means of escape as the staff turned on them. The storm outside masked the screams, the thunder drowning out the chaos that unfolded within the walls. In the girls' dormitory, Clara and Amelia clung to each other, hiding under a bed as Miss Hawthorne and Miss Porter moved through the room, their movements swift and merciless. Clara, ever defiant, whispered to Amelia to stay quiet, but the fear in her friend's eyes mirrored her own. Across the grounds, James and Thomas Reed, the quiet boy with the journal, tried to rally the other boys, banging on the locked door, but their efforts were futile. Mr. Grayson and Mr. Dubois entered, their faces devoid of emotion, and the room filled with the sounds of struggle and despair. The violence was brutal, unrelenting. The children, so full of life and dreams just weeks ago, were no match for the adults, who had once been their guardians. Some fought back. Clara threw a chair at Miss Hawthorne. James tackled Miss Grayson in a desperate bid to protect the younger boys, but their resistance only delayed the inevitable. The staff used whatever was at hand, canes, ropes, even the heavy candelabra from the chapel, turning the tools of discipline into instruments of death. The dormitories, once places of whispered camaraderie, became scenes of unimaginable horror. The floors, slick with blood, the air thick with the screams of the terrified and the dying. Thomas, clutching his journal as if it could protect him, hid in a corner scribbling frantic words until he too was found. Amelia, her blonde curls matted with sweat, whispered a prayer before she was silent. The massacre was not the result of a sudden frenzy, but a deliberate act, carried out with a chilling efficiency that suggested planning and intent. The staff moved methodically, room by room, ensuring no child was spared. The locked doors and barred windows ensured there was no escape, no chance for the children to flee into the storm-soaked night. The forest, forbidden and ominous, stood silent beyond the grounds, its shadows offering no refuge. The chapel bell, which had marked the rhythm of their days, tolled once during the night, a single mournful note that seemed to signal the completion of the staff's grim task. By the time the storm began to wane, the dormitories were silent. The 26 children, Amelia, Clara, James, Thomas and their peers gone, their lives snuffed out in the place that was meant to be their sanctuary. As dawn broke, the storm retreated, leaving behind a sky streaked with grey, and a campus eerily still. The rain had washed away much of the evidence outside, but inside the dormitories told a story of unspeakable violence. Beds were overturned, walls marked with desperate scratches, and the air hung heavy with the metallic scent of blood. The staff, however, were nowhere to be found. Their quarters were empty, their personal belongings untouched, as if they had simply walked into the night and vanished. Warwick's office, with its heavy oak desk and shelves of leather-bound books, was undisturbed, but the man himself was gone, his absence a final enigma. The groundskeeper, Miss Finch, who had been seen digging in the gardens at odd hours, was also missing, his spade left leaning against a tree at the edge of the forest. The children's bodies, hidden in the chaos of the night, were scattered across the dormitories, some dragged to the basement, others left where they fell. The staff's disappearance added a layer of mystery to the horror, as if their purpose had been fulfilled and they had no reason to remain. The school, once a symbol of order and prestige, was now a tomb, its grand halls and manicured lawns a mockery of the promises it had made to the families who entrusted their children to its care. The storm, now past, had done nothing to cleanse the grounds. It had only concealed the immediate aftermath, leaving the truth buried within the walls. The night of terror marked the end of St. Augustine's as a place of learning, but it was only the beginning of its legacy as a site of horror. The children, who had arrived with dreams of knowledge and friendship, had been betrayed in the most profound way, their lives stolen in a single night of calculated brutality. The staff's motives remained unclear, whether driven by madness, a twisted ideology, or something even darker. No answers were left behind. The locked doors, the barred windows, the storm's relentless cover, all pointed to a plan that had been set in motion long before that fateful night. As the sun rose over the silent campus, St. Augustine stood abandoned, its secrets locked within its walls, waiting for the world to uncover the tragedy that had unfolded under the cover of darkness.
In the days following the Night of Terror in November 1910, an uneasy silence settled over St. Augustine's Academy, its red brick facade standing resolute against the grey California sky. The storm that had masked the massacre had passed, leaving the ground sodden and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay. The school, isolated 10 miles from the nearest village of Harrow's Crossing, had always been a place apart, its distance fostering a sense of detachment from the world beyond its wrought iron gates. But now that isolation became a shroud, concealing the horrors within, the 26 children, whose laughter and whispers had once filled the dormitories, were silent, their absence unnoticed by the outside world, until the lack of communication from the school began to raise alarms. It was this silence, broken letters, missed visits, and unanswered inquiries that drew the townsfolk's suspicion, leading to a discovery that would haunt California for generations. The first signs of trouble came from the families. Parents, accustomed to receiving regular letters from their children, grew anxious when weeks passed without word. Amelia Carter's mother, a San Francisco socialite, noted that her daughter's usually frequent cheerful notes had stopped abruptly after early November. James Whitaker's father, the railroad magnate, received no response to his inquiries about a planned visit for the holidays. Thomas Reed's parents, the Los Angeles bankers, found their latest letter returned, stamped with a vague note about delivery issues. At first these were dismissed as oversights. Perhaps the school's strict policies had delayed mail, or the children were too busy with studies. But as days turned into weeks, the absence of communication became impossible to ignore. Families began contacting each other, discovering that none had heard from their children, and a shared unease took root. By mid-November, a group of parents, led by Clara's father, the Sacramento senator, demanded answers, dispatching telegrams to Dr. Elias Warwick, the headmaster, only to receive no reply. In Harrow's Crossing, the village closest to St. Augustine's, whispers of concern began to circulate. The school had always been a distant presence, its grand campus a source of pride, but rarely visited by locals. Delivery wagons, which typically brought supplies weekly, returned with reports of locked gates and no one to receive their goods. The driver, a gruff man named Mr. Harrow, spoke of an eerie stillness, the chapel bells silent for the first time in years. The villagers, though hesitant to interfere with the prestigious institution, grew restless. Old superstitions about the school's isolation and the forbidden forest beyond its grounds resurfaced, fueled by stories of strange lights seen flickering in the windows at night. A local farmer claimed to have heard faint cries carried on the wind, though he dismissed them as foxes or the storm's aftermath. It was Mr. Harrow, spurred by a sense of duty, who finally alerted the county sheriff, urging an investigation. On November 22, 1910, a small party led by Sheriff Daniel Boone set out for St. Augustine's, accompanied by Mr. Harrow, 2 deputies, and a handful of concerned townsfolk. The 10-mile journey along the winding dirt road was somber, the group's mood darkened by the overcast sky and the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. As they approached the school, the wrought iron gate stood ajar, creaking in the breeze, an unusual lapse for a place known for its meticulous order. The grounds, once pristine, were unkempt, the lawns muddy and trampled, as if abandoned in haste. The main building loomed ahead, its tall windows dark, the ivy clinging to its walls now seeming to choke rather than adorn. The sheriff's calls for Dr. Warwick or any staff member went unanswered, the silence broken only by the distant caw of a crow circling the forest's edge. Forcing entry was no small task. The heavy oak doors of the main building were locked, the bolts rusted as if untouched for weeks. The deputies, wielding crowbars, pried them open, the wood splintering with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the musty scent of neglect. The grand hall, once polished and imposing, was in disarray, chairs overturned, papers scattered across the floor, a chandelier flickering weakly as if its gas supply had dwindled. The portraits of past headmasters still hung on the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch the intruders with silent judgment. The sheriff's lantern cast long shadows, revealing the first signs of horror, smears of blood on the oak floors, faint but unmistakable, trailing toward the dormitories. The group split up to search the sprawling campus, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The boys' dormitory was the first to be entered, and the sight that greeted them stopped the men in their tracks. The narrow beds were in chaos, blankets torn, mattresses stained with dark dried pool. The bodies of several boys, James, Henry and others, lay where they had fallen, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain. Some had been dragged to corners, their limbs twisted unnaturally, as if the killers had tried to hide their work but abandoned the effort. Thomas Reed's small form was found slumped against a wall, his journal clutched in his hands, its pages smeared with blood but still legible, filled with frantic notes about the night's event. The sheriff, a hardened man who had seen his share of tragedy, felt his stomach churn as he realized the scale of the violence. The girls' dormitory was no less horrific, Clara and Amelia were found together, hidden beneath a bed, their hands clasped as if seeking comfort in their final moment. The other girls, some as young as 10, were scattered across the room, their uniforms torn, their bodies bearing the marks of a brutal struggle. The walls bore scratches, as if the children had clawed at them in desperation, and a broken chair lay near Clara, a testament to her defiance even in the face of death. The deputies, hardened by years of service, wept openly, their lanterns trembling as they uncovered the lifeless forms of the 26 children who had been entrusted to the school's care. Further exploration revealed the extent of the massacre. In the basement accessed through a locked door that required a sledgehammer to breach, more bodies were found, some hastily covered with tarps, others left exposed in the damp stone-walled room. The classrooms, once places of learning, were stained with violence, desks overturned, books soaked in blood, a blackboard scrawled with a single, cryptic word, purify. The chapel, with its stained glass windows depicting saints, was eerily untouched save for a single candelabrum lying on the floor, its wax pooled like blood. The grounds outside yielded additional horrors, shallow pits near the forest's edge, where Miss Finch's spade had clearly been at work, though no bodies were found within, suggesting the staff had planned to dispose of their victims but fled before completing the task. The discovery shook the group to its core. The sheriff, his voice hoarse, ordered the area secured, though there was no one left to protect or apprehend. The staff, Dr. Warwick, Miss Hawthorne, Mr. Grayson, and the others, were gone, their quarters empty, their belongings untouched. Warwick's office held no clues, only neatly arranged books and papers, as if he had stepped out for a moment rather than vanished after a massacre. The groundskeeper's shed was similarly abandoned, Mr. Finch's spade leaning against a tree, its blade caked with dirt and something dark. The absence of the staff was as chilling as the children's deaths, leaving the investigators with no one to question, no one to blame. Word of the discovery spread quickly, reaching Harrow's Crossing by nightfall, and the cities beyond by the next day. Families descended on the school, their grief turning to rage as they saw the fate of their children. The newspapers, from San Francisco to Los Angeles, ran lurid headlines: Massacre at St. Augustine's, House of Horror in California. The authorities launched a manhunt for the missing staff, but no trace was found, no sightings, no records, no explanations. The school's isolation, once its strength, now mocked the investigators, offering no witnesses, no lead. The forest was searched, its dense undergrowth combed for days, but it yielded nothing but shadows and silence. The horrifying discovery at St. Augustine's marked it as a place of infamy, its once proud reputation replaced by a legacy of tragedy. The 26 children, whose names would be etched into California's history, had been betrayed in the most profound way, their lives stolen in a place meant to nurture. The blood-stained dormitories, the cryptic messages, the vanished staff, all pointed to a crime that was not just brutal but orchestrated, its motives buried with the perpetrator. As the townsfolk and authorities stood amid the wreckage, the weight of the loss settled over them, a wound that would not heal. Augustine's, with its grand halls and manicured lawns, was no longer a school but a monument to horror, its secrets locked within its walls, waiting to haunt those who dared to remember. The aftermath of the massacre at Augustine's Academy in November 1910 left a wound that bled beyond the blood-stained dormitories and into the collective psyche of California. The discovery of the 26 murdered children had shaken Harrow's Crossing and the cities beyond, but it was the absence of the perpetrators, the staff, who had carried out the unthinkable that cast the longest shadow. Dr. Elias Warwick, Miss Clara Hawthorne, Mr. Theodore Grayson, Langley, Miss Porter, Mr. Dubois and the enigmatic groundskeeper Mr. Finch had vanished without a trace, as if the storm that cloaked the night of terror had swallowed them whole. Their disappearance was not just a mystery, it was a chilling enigma that deepened the horror, leaving investigators, families and the public grasping for answers that never. The staff's flight, so complete and so sudden, suggested a purpose that went beyond mere escape, fueling speculation that the massacre was no act of madness, but part of something far more sinister. The investigation began immediately after the bodies were discovered, with Sheriff Daniel Boone and his deputies scouring the school for any clue to the staff's whereabouts. The main building, the dormitories, and the chapel were meticulously searched, but the staff's personal quarters offered little insight. Warwick's office, with its polished oak desk and shelves of leather-bound books, was disturbingly pristine, as if he had stepped out for a lecture rather than fled a crime scene. His papers, neatly stacked, contained only lesson plans, student records, and correspondence with parents,
Nothing to suggest a motive or a destination. Miss Hawthorne's room held a few personal items, a hairbrush, a stack of poetry books, a locket with no photograph inside. Mr. Grayson's quarters were similarly sparse, his ink-stained desk empty save for a single unmarked ledger. The other teachers' rooms followed the same pattern, minimal and personal as if they had never intended to stay long. Finch's shed near the forest's edge was the most barren, containing only gardening tools and that solitary spade, its blade still caked with dirt and a dark, unidentifiable stain. The authorities expanded their search beyond the school, combing the surrounding hills and the dense, forbidden forest that had always loomed over St. Augustine. The forest, with its tangled undergrowth and towering oaks, was a daunting prospect, its shadows seeming to resist the lanterns of the search party. Volunteers from Harrow's Crossing joined the effort, hacking through brambles and calling out names, but the woods yielded nothing. No footprints, no discarded belongings, no sign that the staff had passed through. The shallow pits near the forest's edge, where Finch had been seen digging, were examined, but they were empty, their purpose unclear. Some speculated that the staff had planned to bury the children there but abandoned the task in their haste to flee. Others whispered that the pits were meant for something else entirely, though no one could say what. Theories about the staff's disappearance multiplied, each more outlandish than the last. In Harrow's Crossing, where gossip spread like wildfire, some believed the staff had fled to a distant city, perhaps San Francisco or Los Angeles, where they could blend into the crowd, but no sightings were reported, and the lack of any trail train tickets, bank withdrawals, or even a single witness made this seem unlikely. Others, influenced by the village's old superstitions, suggested the staff had been taken by the forest itself, swallowed by the same shadows the children had feared. The most persistent theory, whispered in hushed tones, was that the staff had been part of a cult, their actions part of a ritualistic sacrifice. The cryptic word purified, scrawled on a classroom blackboard, Warwick's strange sermons about cleansing and the rhythmic chants Samuel had heard in the basement, lent weight to this idea. Some pointed to the school's isolation, its forbidden forest, and the staff's secretive behavior as evidence of a hidden agenda, perhaps one rooted in occult practices that had culminated in the massacre. Newspapers across California seized on the cult theory, printing sensational headlines that only deepened the public's fascination and fear. Cult of cruelty at St. Augustine's blared one San Francisco Chronicle article speculating that Warwick, with his commanding presence and cryptic sermons, had led his staff in a deranged ritual. The Los Angeles Times ran a story titled "The Vanished Teachers, a Pact with Darkness," suggesting the staff had performed the killings as an offering to some unknown force before disappearing to avoid earthly justice. These stories, though speculative, were fueled by the lack of concrete evidence. No records of Dr. Warwick or his staff predating their time at St. Augustine's could be found, as if they had materialized from nowhere. Their credentials, once unquestioned, now seemed suspect, with universities listed in their files denying any record of. It was as if the staff had been ghosts, their identities as carefully constructed as the school's facade of respectability. The families of the murdered children, consumed by grief and rage, demanded answers. Clara's father, the Sacramento senator, used his influence to pressure the authorities, offering rewards for information leading to the staff's capture. Amelia's mother organized vigils in San Francisco, her tearful pleas for justice drawing crowds and reporters. James's father, the railroad magnate, hired private investigators, who scoured the state but found no leads. Thomas's parents, clutching their son's blood-stained journal, read his final entries, frantic notes about the staff's strange behavior, the locked doors, the terror of that night, and wept for the boy who had seen the truth but could not escape it. The family's anguish was compounded by the absence of closure. Without the staff to face trial, there was no one to punish, no one to explain why their children had been taken. The authorities, frustrated by the lack of progress, turned to the school's history for clues. Augustine's had been founded only 20 years earlier, its origins tied to a wealthy but reclusive benefactor, who had since died. The school's records, meticulously kept, revealed nothing unusual: budgets, enrollment lists, maintenance logs, but they ended abruptly in early November, as if the staff had ceased all administrative work before the massacre. Some investigators speculated that the staff had planned their disappearance well in advance, perhaps even before the school year began. The locked doors, the barred windows, the storm's convenient cover, all pointed to a premeditated act, not a spontaneous outburst. But the question gnawed at everyone, from the sheriff, to the reporters, to the grieving parents. Was it madness, fanaticism, or something else entirely? The absence of answers left a void that speculation rushed to fill. In Harrow's Crossing, the villagers began to avoid the road to St. Augustine's, their pride in the school replaced by dread. Children were forbidden from playing near the forest, and adults spoke of the staff's disappearance in hushed tones, as if naming them might summon them back. Some claimed to have seen figures in the woods at night, tall, cloaked shapes like those the children had whispered about, though no evidence was ever found. Others reported hearing faint chants carried on the wind, similar to those Samuel had described in the base. These stories, dismissed as superstition by the authorities, took root in the village's collective imagination, turning St. Augustine's into a place of legend, a cautionary tale whispered around hearths. The vanished staff remained an enigma, their fate as elusive as their motive. Had they fled to another state, another country, their identities discarded like the school they left behind? Had they perished in the forest, their bodies hidden in its depths? Or had they, as some dared to believe, been part of something otherworldly, their disappearance a step into a realm beyond human understanding? The lack of closure gnawed at the investigators, who eventually scaled back their efforts, leaving the case open but unsolved. The school's gates were locked, its grounds left to the mercy of time and weather, but the mystery of the staff lingered, a specter that refused to fade. The disappearance of Dr. Warwick and his staff became the final chilling chapter of the St. Augustine's tragedy, a puzzle with no solution. Their absence transformed the massacre from a crime to a myth, a story that would be told and retold, each version more haunting than the last. The children's deaths were a wound, but the staff's vanishing was a scar, a reminder that some truths remain buried, even when the blood has long since dried. As the years passed, Augustine's would fade into obscurity, but the question of what happened to its staff would endure, a dark thread in the tapestry of California's hidden history, whispering of secrets that might never be uncovered.
By the winter of 1910, St. Augustine's Academy stood abandoned, its once grand red brick facade a hollow shell on the outskirts of California's rolling hills. The massacre of the 26 children and the mysterious disappearance of the staff had transformed the school from a beacon of prestige into a monument of horror, its name whispered with dread in Harrow's Crossing and beyond. The wrought iron gates, now rusted and chained shut, marked a boundary between the world and the place where innocence had been betrayed. The manicured lawns grew wild, choked with weeds, and the ivy that clung to the walls seemed to tighten its grip as if claiming the building for the shadows. The forest beyond, always forbidden, loomed larger in the imaginations of those who passed by, its dense canopy hiding secrets no one dared to seek. More than a century later, the story of St. Augustine's and its 26 lost children would endure as one of the darkest chapters in California's hidden history, a legacy of darkness that refused to fade. The immediate aftermath of the massacre saw the school sealed off, its doors bolted and windows boarded, though no one could say whether this was to keep intruders out or something else in. The authorities, overwhelmed by the scale of the tragedy and the lack of answers, declared the campus a crime scene, but the investigation stalled without the staff to interrogate or tangible leads to follow. The families of the children, Amelia, Clara, James, Thomas and the others, grieved in their respective cities, their lives forever altered. Clara's father, the Sacramento senator, pushed for a memorial, but his efforts were overshadowed by public fascination with the mystery. Newspapers, from the San Francisco Chronicle to the Los Angeles Times, continued to publish lurid accounts, speculating about cults, rituals and supernatural forces. The public's hunger for answers only deepened the school's infamy, turning it into a cautionary tale that parents told their children to instill fear of disobedience or wandering too far from home. Harrow's Crossing, the nearest village, became the unwilling keeper of St. Augustine's legacy. The villagers, once proud of their proximity to the prestigious academy, now avoided the winding dirt road that led to its gates. They spoke of strange occurrences in hushed tones, their stories growing with each retelling. Farmers claimed to hear children's screams carried on the wind at night, high and desperate, as if the 26 were still crying out for help. Others reported seeing candlelight flickering in the school's upper windows, though no one had entered the building in years. A hunter, venturing too close to the forest's edge, swore he saw a cloaked figure watching him from the trees, its face obscured, vanishing when he approached. These tales, dismissed by outsiders as superstition, took root in the village, where children were forbidden from playing near the school and adults crossed themselves when passing the road's turnoff. The forest itself became a focal point of the legend. Always off limits during the school's operation, it now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its shadows darker, its silence heavier. Some villagers believed the staff, Dr. Warwick, Miss Hawthorne, Grayson, and the others, had fled into its depths, either to hide or to complete some unholy ritual. Others whispered that the forest was more than a hiding place, that it was alive in some unnatural way, complicit in the staff's disappearance and the children's fate. Old-timers in Harrow's Crossing recalled stories from before the school's founding, tales of strange happenings in the woods, lights that moved without source, voices that spoke no known language. These stories, once dismissed, now seemed prophetic, and the forest became a place to avoid, its edge marked by makeshift shrines of flowers and crosses left by grieving families. As decades passed, St. Augustine's deteriorated, its walls crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. The red brick facade cracked, the ivy growing wild, and the chapel's stained glass windows shattered in storms, leaving jagged holes like wounds. Yet the school's presence lingered, its story passed down through generations. By the 1920s it had become a dare for local youths, who crept to the gates at night, challenging each other to touch the rusted iron or peer through the boarded window. Few went further. Those who did returned with stories of cold air that clung to their skin, of whispers that seemed to come from within the wall. One boy, in 1925, claimed to have found a blood-stained journal, perhaps Thomas Reed's, beneath a dormitory floorboard, but it vanished before he could show it to anyone, adding to the myth. By the 1950s, the school was a ghost story told around campfires, its details embellished but its core unchanged. 26 children, betrayed and murdered, their killers gone without a trace. Theories about the massacre and the staff's disappearance evolved over time, each generation adding its own interpretation. Some clung to the cult theory, pointing to the cryptic clues, the word purified on the blackboard, the chants heard in the basement, Warwick's sermons about cleansing as evidence of a ritualistic motive. Others believed the staff had been driven by a collective madness, perhaps triggered by the school's isolation or some external influence. A few, influenced by the growing popularity of spiritualism in the early 20th century, suggested the school was built on cursed ground, the forest itself a malevolent force that had corrupted the staff and claimed the children. Historians and amateur sleuths pored over what records remained, but the school's origins were murky, its benefactors' identity vague, and the staff's pasts unverifiable. The absence of concrete evidence only fueled the speculation, turning St. Augustine's into a puzzle that defied solving. By the late 20th century, the school had become a cultural touchstone, referenced in books, articles, and even a few low-budget horror films. Paranormal investigators visited the site, their equipment picking up unexplained sounds, faint sobs, footsteps, a bell tolling in the absence of a ring. These findings, though inconclusive, kept the story alive, drawing curious outsiders to Harrow's Crossing. The villagers, tired of the attention, rarely spoke to these visitors, their silence a mix of resentment and fear. The school's grounds, now overgrown and treacherous, were off limits, but that didn't stop thrill seekers from sneaking in, leaving behind graffiti or trinkets as offerings to the lost children. Some claimed to feel a presence, a weight that made breathing difficult, as if the air itself remembered the tragedy. In the 21st century, St. Augustine's remained a dark legend, its story preserved in local histories and online forums where true crime enthusiasts debated the details. The children's names, Amelia Carter, Clara, James Whitaker, Thomas Reed, and the others, were etched into a small memorial plaque in Harrow's Crossing, though few visited it. The forest, still dense and foreboding, was avoided even by developers, who shunned the land despite its proximity to growing cities. The school itself, or what remained of it, stood as a ruin, its walls collapsing, its dormitories open to the sky. Yet, the stories persisted, screams heard at midnight, candlelight in empty windows, cloaked figures at the forest's edge. Whether these were real or imagined, they ensured that St. Augustine's would never be forgotten. The legacy of St. Augustine's was not just in its tragedy, but in the questions it left unanswered. Why had the staff committed such an atrocity? Where had they gone? What was the purpose of the massacre? If purpose there, the children's deaths, so brutal and senseless, were a wound that time could not heal, their dreams of knowledge and friendship snuffed out in a single night. The staff's disappearance, whether by human cunning or something darker, added a layer of mystery that made the story enduringly haunting. St. Augustine's was more than a place. It was a warning, a reminder that even in the guise of safety,
evil could lurk. As the years stretched into centuries, the school's legacy of darkness endured, a chilling chapter in California's history, whispering of 26 lives lost and the truth that remained just out of reach, hidden in the shadows of a forsaken campus and the silent forest beyond. As the echoes of Augustine's Academy fade into the mist of California's forgotten hills, the story of the 26 children and the vanished staff lingers like a ghost, haunting us with its unanswered questions and chilling truth. This tale of betrayal, horror, and mystery is more than just a dark chapter in history. It's a reminder of the fragility of trust and the shadows that can lurk behind even the most polished facade. The screams heard in the night, the flickering candlelight in abandoned windows, and the silent forest that seems to guard its secrets all beckon us to wonder what really happened that fateful night. Was it madness, a sinister ritual, or something even darker that claimed those young lives and spirited away the perpetrators? The legacy of St. Augustine's endures, a wound that time cannot heal, urging us to look closer, to question and to never forget. What do I think of this story? It's a gripping and haunting narrative that blends historical tragedy with elements of mystery and the supernatural, capturing the imagination while stirring deep unease. The isolation of the school, the calculated cruelty of the staff, and the complete disappearance of those responsible create a puzzle that feels both tragically real and eerily otherworldly. It's a story that sticks with you, raising questions about human nature, the cost of unchecked power, and the truths that remain buried. Whether you see it as a cautionary tale or a chilling mystery, it's impossible to walk away unmoved. What about you? What do you think of the Augustine's tragedy? Do you believe the staff fled into the night, or is there something more sinister at play? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your theory. If this story sent shivers down your spine or sparked your curiosity, please give it a like, share it with friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales of mystery and history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Until next time, keep exploring the shadows of the past, and stay curious.